Welcome back to Roundtable Outlook. This goes on air every Wednesday, Prime TV on CSN. And as you all know, we always bring in the famous or popular or well-known personalities to this program, and we discuss some crucial matters about Sri Lanka. Today, we thought of discussing the present situation of Sri Lanka and also the international community and their attitudes. So for that, we thought the best person to invite is the parliamentarian and senior professor and also advisor to HE on reconciliation. Professor Rajiva Wijesinha is here with us. A very good evening to you, Professor.
Good evening. Yeah. Thank you.
Professor, let me start off with a very simple question, but before that, to tell the listeners they can also join us on 2775177 or 2775178, and they can call us and they can ask questions. Any question is invited. So, Professor, let me start off with a very simple question. And you have experience on this, and you were the chief of Peace Secretariat, and you have experience on handling the peace and reconciliation process. Just tell me, what is the attitude you have seen, or any change on the attitude of the international community right now?
Well, I think we've seen certain changes following on, in particular, the publication of the Darasman report, but even more dramatically after the Channel 4 film, and then this book by Gordon Weiss, which is being sold at a rate in various book fairs all over the world. He was in Edinburgh, he's now in Canada. And of course, there is a movement, I think, to whip up a lot of emotion. One of the reasons I'm very sorry for this is that I think in the last year or so, a lot of members of the diaspora who had previously been, some of them forced to support the LTT, some of them perhaps supporting this out of conviction, were moving round to thinking that the best thing to do to help the Tamil people was to work together with the government but focus their attention on our rehabilitation efforts in the north. For instance, we had a group of youngsters from England who came out here, Sinhalese and Tamils, who'd gone back, tried to work together. But immediately after the Channel 4, there was a lot of pressure on them from their friends. And I think part of it is an attempt to whip up feeling just at a time when Sri Lanka is poised to take off economically and socially. So I think it's a great pity. But I think we ourselves are guilty for not having responded robustly and having anticipated some of these criticisms by telling our story, beginning with the end of the war and the beginning of reconstruction 2 years ago. Right. We should have done a better job.
Exactly. Professor, I'm coming to that point. Now, the war has ended in 2009, but still we have problems. Internationally, especially, there are 3 groups operating internationally under the LTT belt. LTT network is active internationally, that's what we say. So one group is active in Britain. It's called BTF, British Tamil Forum, headed by Father Emmanuel. And then Norway group is headed by Mr. Nediaman. And then American group is headed by Vishwanath Rudrakumar. Now, what do you think about these groups, basically, Professor?
Well, they still are following the old LTT agenda. They're very effective. Don't forget that the LTT had this excellent plan in terms of expanding their influence, of infiltrating a lot of the politicians in the West. I think Britain was particularly susceptible to this. One thing that I find odd is that the present Conservative government, having understood until 2009 how committed the LTT groups were to Labour, are now falling for the trap of what is called Tamils for Conservatives. And I've seen occasions on which there have been almost blackmailing letters sent to MPs who've been supportive of us, sort of threatening to withdraw their support. And some elements in the Conservative government, I suppose, are taking the easy option of saying electoral success, let's sacrifice anything to electoral success. I think that's a mistake. I hope that they will grow up about it. I have to say that I think, for instance, the present British High Commissioner in Sri Lanka is less influenced by what I would call the old David Miliband line than his predecessor, who had worked in the Miliband private office. And I think he will do his best to restore relations between Sri Lanka and England. But we have to realize that democracy is a very strange beast. People go for electoral victories and sometimes sacrifice a lot of things to achieve them. And if this is happening in Britain, I think we have to be understanding and help them to overcome these problems.
Okay, Professor, now we have seen these groups, but do you think when we talk about this Tamil diaspora, do you think this Tamil diaspora, the whole group or the whole population is supporting LTTE, or only the groups what I mentioned now? A few people in that group are supporting the LTTE cause.
My view on this is that most people are not interested in the LTTE, as I found when I was
After
there
the
2
war
years
or
ago.
before?
After the war.
Right.
Before the war, they were forced into this position because there was only the LTTE. I'm afraid successive Sri Lankan governments also gave the impression that the Tamils and the LTTE were synonymous. I think the real problem is that after the war, some politicians in the West continued to cling to their old friends. For instance, I was deeply upset when someone in the British Foreign Office said, "Why aren't you talking to the TGTE?" And I said, look, you should be telling us to talk to the Tamils in Sri Lanka. There are Tamils who represent the Sri Lankan people who've lived here. But if you tell us to talk to former terrorist groups, you're actually telling the Tamils in Sri Lanka they don't have a role, that they also must listen to those terrorists. Now, I think America is particularly dangerous because Rudrakumaran is a very sophisticated man. He has very good links. Again, the Tamil groups, because they realized the Republicans were tougher on terror, jumped early onto the Democratic bandwagon. Of course, they thought Hillary Clinton was going to be elected, so they clung to her. And so we were very pleased when Barack Obama was elected instead. But of course, Hillary is Secretary of State.
There was a group, Tamils for Obama or some...
No, then they jumped onto the Obama bandwagon.
Yeah.
But I think the real problem we face there is the tremendous sophistication. For instance, Tamilnet had a report last week of a meeting with Robert Blake. Now, I happen to think Blake is not a bad guy. He has been quite supportive of Sri Lanka, but he's under pressure. And this Tamilnet report was very interesting because on the one hand, it accused Blake of basically being too pro the present Sri Lankan government. But on the other, it actually quoted him as almost helping to create this furore over war crimes. And Robert Blake was here. He knows perfectly well there were no war crimes. But you know, when a bandwagon is being created, it's difficult to resist it, even for someone as intelligent as Blake.
Yeah. So we are reminding the listeners, and my friend, the producer, Roshan, is on the other side. So just to remind the listeners, they can always call us on 2775-177 or 2775-178, and they can ask any questions but relevant to this subject. Professor, now tell me, you said, you know, Rudrakumar is a bit active and very strong. So what are the actions or actions taken by the GOs or the government of Sri Lanka to defend their position, or maybe to keep up their stance?
Well,
how do you put it?
When you answer, I think the question is inappropriate because I think it strikes at the heart of something I have been very critical about, that Sri Lanka tends to defend itself against attacks. That is inappropriate. Sri Lanka should from the start have made it very clear that we'd done a wonderful job in defeating terrorism, and we shouldn't have waited for people to attack us to defend us. The second point is that we should make it very, very clear that the struggle with the LTTE is not the whole story. The story is about Sri Lanka's efforts to create a pluralistic society. And for that, I think we've done a lot of good things. There are other things we should be doing, and I've said this very clearly. But the good things we've done, which are remarkable, are not advertised enough. Now, let me give you a simple example. There is, within Sri Lanka, we have 9 provinces. 2 of them have excellent websites. These are the Northern Province website and the Eastern Province website. I'm afraid a lot of the other provincial websites are dreadful. They're simply accounts of, you know, grandiose sort of tamashas. But many people in Sri Lanka don't know about the Northern Province website. For instance, it is not featured on the websites of our missions abroad. They don't take material from that because the developmental process in the North is fantastic at the moment compared with what it was in the past. There are certain areas we could do better. I think we should do much better on human resources development. We have to change our archaic educational system, which the Minister of Higher Education is trying very hard to do, to allow the energies of our people to be released to promote excellence. There are things we can do, but the development, the roads, the railways, what we've done for agriculture, irrigation is remarkable, and not enough people know. And if you look at the Northern Province website, incidents are there. Now, when I was in Chennai last week and explaining this, it turned out that, you know, many of the Tamil journalists from Chennai, the think tanks, weren't aware of this. We should be publicizing this, and we're not doing it. So I think that is what we should think of, rather than defending ourselves against attacks on extraneous subjects.
So you mean to say the media campaign has to be strong enough to show the reality or the real ground situation of the country.
Absolutely.
Right.
We also need to use things like modern social media. I mean, I'm a bit old for this type of thing, but things like Twitter, Facebook,
Right.
getting a message across. When a good thing happens, how do you get the idea that it's happening to 100,000 people? It's very simple. You use the social media, you target people, you get the diaspora abroad, many of whom are very positive about Sri Lanka, to work together with us to get the good news out, not to just defend against bad news.
How do you look at the IDP situation in the country now?
Well, again, that's an obvious example. I mean, many people think that many of the IDPs are still in the camps, etc. I mean, here's a country that resettled almost all the 300,000 within a couple of years, even though there was mine-infested territory. Not only did we settle them, but we actually managed to give basic services in a way that no other country has. Educational services, water, electricity. Of course, we can do better. The latest resettlements, the housing, should be of a better quality, I think. But still, what we did is pretty good. No one knows about this. There are very few people in the camps. When I was last in the camps about 6 weeks ago, the people there were in no hurry to go back because they come from one of the poorer parts of Mullaitivu, south of that road, so that that is still mined. But the government was trying to actually give them even temporary accommodation till they can go back into the heavily mined land. They said, no, we're quite happy here because they're free to go out and work. But I think we should concentrate on getting them back home and allowing them to use their energies for agriculture. But also the younger generation has to go beyond agriculture. They have to do business. They have to be trained in vocational studies that also allow them to get jobs anywhere in the world. We have to give them IT and English. We're doing nothing about that at the moment, which I find very depressing. We are not keeping our social services at the level of what I would call the infrastructure. The infrastructure is superb. We should be doing better on other areas.
So, Professor, we have more questions to fire at you, but stay tuned. We have a short break. Yes, welcome back. And Professor Rajiva Wijesinha is with us. Professor, tell me now, why some of the Western countries still press on war crimes? Do they have an hidden agenda or genuinely looking into this matter?
I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is very much the pressure from the diaspora, and that is probably the most powerful reason.
When I say still, after 2 years.
Yeah, the second factor is very simply, I think there's in the West a bit of irritation among some people that we didn't conduct the war the way they wanted. There were efforts to tell us to do A, B, C, D, and we just said no. And, you know, obviously some Western politicians, not all, would like to have people they can control, that whose agenda they run. That is not something possible with the president. Unfortunately, some of his predecessors in power, particularly Ranil Wickremesinghe, tended to say yes to whatever they were told. So the habit developed in some countries of thinking any Sri Lankan who says no is somehow a naughty boy. So I'm afraid there's some slight peak in some Western countries about this. You know, why aren't they doing everything we told them to immediately? So there are lots of factors like that we need to take into account. I think there's also a factor that one Republican told me who had worked in the American Ministry of Defense. He said many people in the Obama administration were, had bleeding hearts about human rights. But unfortunately, when they came to power, they found that a lot of the principles they'd enunciated in attacking George Bush couldn't be avoided because they couldn't tell Obama to close Guantanamo, they couldn't tell Obama to withdraw immediately from Afghanistan, they couldn't stop the drone strikes, they couldn't stop some of the oppressive things on the Shiites in Iraq. So what do? They pick on a poor country that doesn't really have something that can stand up to them. And one of the Americans tells to me really very entertainingly, he said, look, if you guys just do a few things that the present American administration want, they'll tell people like Samantha Power to go and concentrate on Djibouti rather than bullying Sri Lanka. But you know, we're not going to kowtow in any way. I think any reasonable suggestion made, we'd be very happy to, because we like working with the West. But if they're going to make unreasonable demands on us, how on earth can we give in to them? I think, for instance, the sort of behavior they exhibited over, you know, Sarath Fonseca, etc., suggests very much an agenda that is not, let me say, consistent or genuine. But and I worry about that.
Professor, but the Western countries, especially America and the other countries, they are pressing on the investigations to be done on these war crimes, possible war crimes, or maybe so-called war crimes, in acceptable norms of international standard. What do you mean by these acceptable norms of international standard? They have been using these words, keep on saying the same thing, accepted in that international norms.
We see one of our problems is that we're too slow. We made a commitment to look into any possible allegations. Now, that I think we should make it very clear that of the many allegations that have been made against us, there should be a scientific analysis to show that almost all of them, but not all of them. I think some of them, you know, we need to look more carefully. But what I would call a prima facie case simply doesn't exist with regard to some of the absurdities, suggestions that we were deliberately bombing hospitals, absolute rubbish, and we have argued this case before, suggestions that we were deliberately targeting civilians. That's absurd. We should point that out very, very clearly. There are other suggestions that we are starving the civilians. I mean, that's absolute nonsense. We have all the documentation to show that this is not the case. Now, we should have actually documented all this earlier to show how we fought the war, showed the strategies that were used. All that was a failure. There are some incidents I think we need to look more closely. I have always argued that things like the white flag case should be looked at more closely. But I think even on that, there are very good reasons for being able to show that the claims made by certain parties are not correct. But you know, we can't just go into what I call blanket denial and say, no, 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 you have to answer with evidence. I think we have a lot of the evidence. I'm sorry that we haven't done that. Secondly, I think although the LLRC, you know, I've said it's a bit slow, and I've been condemned for saying this. My problem is that the LLRC, which was appointed some years ago, did a superb interim report. You know, they really showed that they were thinking very deeply. I think it would have helped if they brought out another interim report.
But do you think that, you know, that came at a time when the Darusman report came out?
No, no, no. The first interim report was issued last September, and we didn't publicize it enough. But if you look at it, it shows a really close commitment to reconciliation. That is its main purpose. War crimes is a secondary factor for the LLRC. So these are areas where we should have publicized that more. I think we should have. Way back in 2009, the American State Department issued a report which was very politely put. This was because before some people got onto what I call the Sarath Fonseca trip. But before that, the Americans were very circumspect. They gave us a little document in which they said the following charges are made. We are not saying they're correct or not, quite unlike Darusman, but could you look into them? And again, it was not political, because one of them actually focused on something Sarath Fonseca said. Now, I think Sri Lanka was too slow to respond to that, because that was politely put. My point is, if people make charges against us politely, or not even charges, if they raise questions politely, it is only polite to answer. And we are a bit slow on things like that, which I think was a pity.
Correct. Professor, we have a listener from Nugegoda. Hello, can you just tell your name and background and come up with a question, please?
Hello, I'm Shanika.
Yes.
My question is removal of the Emergency Act. How does it impact the current political situation in our country?
Okay, that's a good question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I think the first thing about the emergency being removed is that it expresses a lot of the relief we have that we're no longer in a state of emergency. I think the fact that there is no emergency and that emergency regulations are not required is a marker of the normality that has returned to Sri Lanka.
Restored.
However, we have to bear in mind that particularly in the present international context of potential terrorist threats, you can't actually go back to the situation before, you know, when I was small. For instance, America introduced what's called the Homeland Security Act.
Yes.
Britain has extended the possibility of detention without charge. So we have to be careful. Now at the moment we're exercising some of those powers through the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And even though I deplore the way that act was implemented in the 1970s when President Jawaharlal introduced it, and I think contributed to increasing terrorism, I still think we probably need a mechanism following on the model of what other countries have done to make sure that terrorism is allowed to grow. We have also a major problem which some of these other countries don't have, that the fundraising that's going on for terrorism and potential terrorism is allowed to go unchecked in some parts of the world. You know, whereas America can control the funding that goes into Al-Qaeda and whatever. And although I think America was quite positive about stopping funding for LTT terrorism, there are still hidden ways in which this is going on in some countries. Some Western politicians told me in Europe, we don't have ways of stopping this. They should make a better effort, and until they make a better effort to stop terrorism, I'm afraid we have to keep up precautionary measures, but not allow them to be extended as the emergency sometimes allowed into ordinary crimes and so on. Those should be dealt with in the rule of law in the ordinary sense.
Yeah, do you think basically, coming back to that same question, following it up, removing the emergency regulations has given a kind of a freedom to the Tamil speaking, or especially the Tamils in this country, to enjoy their freedom? What do you think?
Well, I think they enjoyed their freedom before that.
do.
I think there's, I think it's absurd to say that the emergency regulations were used in any way in the last couple of years against the Tamil-speaking people in particular. I think emergency regulations were kept going because of things that had happened earlier, which were terrorist activities. They were also important in order to allow us to move more smoothly on things like rehabilitation, and some of those have to be adjusted. But I think the real problem with the emergency regulations is that they gave a wrong image of an emergency. And I think government was right to say there are certain things we need to continue to do to make sure terrorism doesn't arise again. But we ought to get rid of the emergency regulations because they create a blanket impression. And getting rid of that blanket impression was important.
Yeah.
But I don't think there has been any suggestion that in the last 2 years those regulations have been used for adversely, particularly with regard to Tamils. Not at all.
But if you look at the emergency regulation, one of the regulation, if I remember, if I'm not mistaken, say if somebody is arrested on suspicion, he can be kept for months there, or he can be remanded for months there.
Precisely, and that's why you had to get rid of that. But that was also used when the police should have been using measures under the law to expedite investigation. So I think it's a very good thing it's been removed, because the point is when you have regulations and an emergency regulation, they are subject to abuse by policemen who are slow in investigation. They think, oh, we'll keep him for another month or whatever, we don't have to report. That should not happen. I mean, if there's a specific question of terrorism, obviously you have to be more careful. But as I said, the word emergency allowed it for abuse in a lot of instances. And that was not specifically against the Tamil people in the last 2 years. If you give me any instances, I don't think you will find arrests and detentions on that basis in the last couple of years.
Professor, now, tell me, what are your comments on Darusman report, basically? Was it an output of pre-planned agenda of some country?
No, it was a very vulgar exercise which has no academic standing. It doesn't look at evidence. It has very low standards. And I'm ashamed that people who claim to be professors could have produced stuff in which the footnotes are so shoddy. But I have written on this at length. I have published a book called See No Good, Hear No Good, Speak No Good. I'm going to bring out another one fairly soon, covering a lot of my articles, which go into detail, because the Darusman report simply tells lies. I'll give you one simple example. They go on about attacks on a UN hub on January 23rd. On the 24th, there's a letter from the UN thanking us for our excellent cooperation. They talk of bad conditions in the camp. They obviously didn't talk to the head of the UN, who sent us a letter saying because of government working with the UN, the humanitarian disaster predicted by people was avoided. So they haven't looked at the evidence. For instance, they talk about the food that was sent by the ICRC without looking at the fact that the ICRC specifically thanked our Navy for the support in providing the food, and also mentioned specially the discipline of the sailors who did all this work. But as far as the Darusman report is concerned, who is disciplined in this world? The LTT. Now, if you have academic people who are extolling the discipline of a terrorist group, I really think they need to have their heads examined. You know, that's a vulgarity that should not be tolerated.
So, what do you think? You know, how does this LLRC counterattack the allegations put forward?
The LLRC is not there to counterattack the Darusman report. The LLRC was set up in order to pursue a mandate that is primarily that of reconciliation. If you read my submissions to the LLRC of a year ago, I said it's meant to do three things. One is reconciliation for the future. It must make recommendations. And I said at the time it's not doing enough. In fact, the LLRC a month later produced an interim report that was very positive about the future, what we should do to make the future more positive. Strong recommendations. We should be reporting on what we're doing in that respect. Some of those things are being done well, some are slow. But we must move and respect the LLRC by fulfilling their recommendations more thoroughly and more quickly. The second element, which they were going into the lessons learnt about the past, and my view is they were spending a bit more time on that than we should have, because there was a lot of recrimination about the appalling things done by, you know, elements in the 2002-3 government, by the LTT, by some of the people who are trying to tell us to negotiate when we were being subject to terror. But, you know, we know that story. I don't think it required so much. The third element, which is what I gather the LLRC has done a lot of in the last year, which is one reason taken so long, which is collecting testimony from people about what they suffered. And I think in that case there are two areas they need to act. One, of course, is what we call restorative justice, which is to make sure that people who suffered because of terrorism and because of the war get some compensation and are allowed to live better lives for the future, encouraged and supported to do this. But the second area is, if there are questions of allegations of war crimes, we should look into them. And I think that is something we owe ourselves. It's nothing to do with Darusman. As I said, reading through the Darusman report, it's so replete with things that are so easily shown to be lies. We don't need to take that seriously. But we should look at anything in there where specific dates and times are mentioned, not the generalizations, and go into it and perhaps show what really happened.
Yes. Professor, we have a short break to go and we have a time check. And once we come back, we will have more questions. Yes, so we have Professor Rajiva Wijesinha today giving you more information about the questions what we have asked, and has already given a lot of explanation on certain situations. Professor, we were talking about this Darusman report and LLRC. Just, you know, following it up, you know, just wanted to touch on this Channel 4 video. Say they have released a Channel 4 video once, about 2 years ago, and then came back with another version recently. And within a very short period, they released another version. How do you look at these releases? Well,
Channel 4 is a very peculiar organization. It is money-driven. It also wants sensation. I think if you look at the sequence, it's actually quite entertaining. The first video, which was released, I think, in August 2009, purported to be of the execution of various people. And they said it was an incident that occurred in January 2009. We were able to show that the metadata show the date in July. We were able to show very peculiar things like a dead man's leg moving, etc. Channel 4 refused to give that video to anybody. The UN got a copy from somewhere else, which was significantly different. They claimed that the leg moved because the man might have been drunk. I mean, some sort of strange expert. So then Channel 4 produced a second video. That video came out sometime last year. That was a longer version. and it turned out that the first video had been wrapped into the second video. They still claimed it came from a mobile phone, but it was filmed backwards. Apparently it was edited, and the first segment came third, and the third segment came first, and the fifth segment came from another day or another time. But they still said it was a mobile phone, but somehow this soldier taking a trophy had then edited it wrong. That is how the wrong date appeared, July 17th. They said that was metadata from editing. They said it was optical zooms, which apparently phones don't have. So clearly there's some lies here. And I'm not saying the incidents are necessarily wrong. Meanwhile, as you know, for instance, in Canada recently, the LTT, people who fought for the LTT were convicted. One, of having participated in the execution of Sri Lankan soldiers with AK-47s. Secondly, a chap was actually found guilty and said that he was, therefore a member of the LTT to be deported, because although he said he didn't fight, he was part of the propaganda wing and he made videos. And his defense lawyer said, well, maybe the videos he made were spoofs. Right. So here is a defense lawyer saying we used to make spoof videos. So what are the spoofs of? Obviously they are trying to throw blame on other people. So I think there's a lot of suspicion about this two videos. Then they produced a third film this time, an hour-long film which incorporates some of the videos. I think some of the material it incorporated was probably accurate, but they wove it in with a narrative told essentially by, I would say, two self-confessed fictionalists, Gordon Weiss, who has written a book in which he glorifies suicide bombers and says the modern world doesn't understand the courage that goes into becoming a suicide bomber. And then he goes on a long trip about what happened in Nazi Germany. A lady called Damilvani, who apparently came to visit relatives in 2008. Who are her relatives? LTT leadership. Not her real brother, they say, because the real family is there. So she was obviously an operative. And then there was a rather eccentric man called Benjamin Dix, yes, who in fact, what was so interesting is that 2 years ago I wrote that this guy, who had been running around Geneva and was stopped by the UN, I wrote then he's going to be recycled sometime soon. And sure enough he was. He's another strange figure. So there's this bizarre narrative that actually tells clearly definable lies. For instance, they talk of hospitals being shelled when the coordinates were given. I've now got all the documentation from the ICRC. And there are only 3 faxes about hospitals given between, I think, January and February. Into those 3 hospitals, there were only 4 occasions, I believe, on which shells fell in 6 weeks, 6 shells in 4 occasions. Not a very large number of dead, and although obviously that's a few deaths too many, it is in the context of clear evidence provided by all these groups, including the UN, that the LTT was drawing up its weapons into that area and delivering fire to our people from that area. Yes. It's a very simple question. What do you do if you're being fired upon? Do you sort of sit back and say, no, I'm not firing back? You have to get rid of the weapon while exercising maximum care not to hit the hospital. And we did. 4 occasions in 6 weeks. It's a better record than anyone else in the world.
Oh, we have to continue on this, but before that, a listener is waiting to ask this question for a long time. Hello, a person from Gaul, I suppose.
Yes, hello, good evening.
Yeah.
Dr. Wijesinha, at the outset, let me congratulate you for your valuable comments and ideas expressed at the interview. And my question is, Dr. Rajiva Wijesinha, as general public, we have our reservations that there is a hidden link with some desperate groups in Sri Lankan political stage, with such as JVP and all. There's a link between JVP and LTT diaspora. How do you comment on that issue, Dr. Rajiva? Do you believe in such links, or can you comment on that issue?
Well, the short answer is I really don't know. I would actually doubt that there are distinct links between a terrorist group like the LTT and a group like the JVP, which has, I think, eschewed and avoided terrorism over the last few years. However, one of the major problems we face is that one of the rather sad features of Sri Lankan politics is people are prepared to take advantage of certain issues, even though they would hesitate to be a proponent of that issue. and they try to involve other extraneous circumstances in order to gain political advantage in Sri Lanka. I don't know whether the LTT is doing it. I do believe that some elements in the UNP certainly did it over the last couple of years. For instance, over the things like the GSP Plus issue and so on. There was, I think, some very shabby behavior by individuals. I would hesitate to characterize any political party as a whole of playing the game of terrorists, and I hope no Sri Lankan will do that. But I'm afraid you cannot account for the behavior of all individuals. Some people just have no concept of behaving decently and for political advantage. But of course that happens in Britain. We've seen that, you know, when the WikiLeaks reveals that David Miliband said very clearly, I am pursuing this for electoral gain. How can we then criticize people who in Sri Lanka also get involved when we have always had within Sri Lanka this oppositional approach, which I think is a pity, but it's been part of our culture for many years.
Right, coming back to this Channel 4 video, Professor. Now, if you look at the history of, you know, when this Channel 4 video was released, at a time when Sri Lanka is trying its best to get this GSP facility, there was a Channel 4 video release. And then His Excellency the President, when he visited London or England, where he was supposed to give a lecture or address the Lords or whatever. So, but now that was the situation where the Channel 4 video came up again. And then Professor G.L. Pires went on another trip where he went to England, and there they tried to give another false propaganda or whatever. And then recently we saw when the parliamentarians or the European Parliamentary chairmanship or the Commonwealth, I think I should say, Commonwealth, if I'm not mistaken, the Commonwealth chairmanship is given to Sri Lanka. When that was given, these people came up with another video. So how do you look at this sequence of events?
Well, I think I've said before, the Channel 4 will do anything for money. And if they, you know, whether it's because they want higher ratings or because they are actually encouraged to do this, don't forget that the Channel 4 record has not been particularly good over the last few years. There are those, for instance, who used to accuse it of being in the Labour Party pocket for various reasons. So I don't think we need even worry about their motivation, except to say that it is evil and wicked, and if it supports the cause of terrorism, they don't care a damn. So I don't think we need worry about them anymore.
Right, just slowly we are trying to, we need to discuss about the matters or the things happening in Tamil Nadu, which is very close to our country. How do you see the reactions of the Tamil Nadu politicians, especially when you look at the Chief Minister, Jayalalitha Jayaram? She tried pressing on Kachitivu matter, but when that failed, she took up the stance on pressing for economic sanctions to Sri Lanka, but that also failed. And then last or not the least, is they are focusing on the three convicted on Rajiv Gandhi assassination. So how do you look at these sequence of events?
Well, I think we have to be very clear. One of the factors about Jayalalitha that we have to remember is that she had been solidly opposed to the LTT right through, and I think that we have to respect. I have always taken up the position that if anyone is totally anti the LTT, which was a terrorist movement, their being pro-Tamil should not be a problem. I think it's the problem of those who confuse the LTT and the Tamils that has always been regrettable. But if, as I told the British some years back, when they brought that thing against us, when they said, no, we are concerned about the IDPs, I said, if you're concerned about the IDPs, say so. That's a perfectly genuine concern. But if you want to go on about war crimes, you're playing a terrorist agenda, and you should stop this. Now, I think one good thing about Jayalalitha is she has never played the LTT card. I think we need to respect that. I think one of the problems is that within Tamil Nadu, as in any country in the world, there are internal political problems. When I was there last week, I think one thing that came across is the deep hostility between Jayalalitha and Mr. Karunanidhi. This is not something we should get involved in, but each of them will want to take advantage against the other. And unfortunately, some of Jayalalitha's supporters were associated with the LTT. There's a particularly nasty man called Mr. Vaiko. And naturally, if your supporters are extreme, you can't cut them off at the roots. You have to deal with them tactfully. You know, even within Sri Lanka itself, I think, you know, within the government there are different points of view. but you don't actually reject that point of view. You try to understand it, and you try to work around it to get a solution to problems that will in the end be just and correct. But you don't actually, if you have people who have supported you electorally, you don't treat them badly, and I don't think we can expect Jala to go badly. I think we can expect her not to allow his rather nasty agenda to take domination. One of the problems, as I said, in Tamil Nadu is that the vast majority of people in all countries and all areas are very moderate. I have the same approach with regard to our negotiations with the TNA. But unfortunately, we look at people we're negotiating with and get upset about what their extreme wings say and say, why don't the moderates control the extremists? Now the real problem is those moderates are looking at us and saying, why don't we control the extremists? And we have to understand that if you're working with people who share your broad ideas, you have to respect their ideas. You may disagree with them. You don't give in to ideas that to my mind would be extremist, but you cannot reject them out of hand in a context in which you are trying to move together through consensus. We have also got to respect that on what I would call the other side. So that I believe firmly that the vast majority of the TNA, having suffered under the LTT, having been made to do things that I think were absolutely wrong between 2000 and, from the time Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvan was killed until Prabhakaran was killed, the LTT exercised disproportionate influence on the TNA. So of course, there were brave people like Ananda Sangari who tried to stand up against them. I think that we have to forgive people who obviously were frightened and therefore seemed in that period when the LTT was the ascendant.
But do you think they were forced to do it?
Well, they were terrified. And don't forget, our government of 2002 to 2003 was negotiating with the LTT. So, the TNA was really rather frightened. And don't forget, the LTT was killing all the Tamils against them. Ananda Sangari had to have more protection than anybody else, apart from Karuna, Douglas and so on. The LTT was vicious towards the Tamil people when the Sri Lankan government seemed to be supporting them. So now that the LTT is over, and I'm sure that the genuine leadership of the TNA is as pleased about this as we are, although they can't admit it.
But do you see any differences in TNA's attitudes?
Absolutely.
Even after 2 years.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know whether you read that Mr. Sumanthiran had made a speech in London, at which point the extremist elements in the LTT, in England, were very nasty to him. Now, we have to recognize that he made a courageous speech. So you have to recognize the good points about moderate forces on all sides.
But they are stressing on this self-determination.
No, if you read the documentation they have given us, we can disagree with much of it, but it is not the LTT agenda, and you have to recognize that. So I think it is important that we move together positively, not being worried by the extremists on the other side, just as we hope that they will work together with us, and not get worried about, people who say no changes can be made or whatever. Because obviously all we want to do is make any changes not in the interests of any separatist movement, but in the interests of the Sri Lankan people. And I think reforms that strengthen people's power at all levels, whether it's the micro level of the Pradeshya Sabha, whether it's the middle level of the Provincial Council, whether it's the central government level, the purpose is to make sure that the people actually have a responsive, accountable government.
Yes, Professor, we have a break to go, and once we come back, we have another 2 or 3 questions.
Right.
Yes, welcome back, and Professor Rajiva Wijesinha. Now tell us Okay, now if you look at this war situation, a 30 years or 3 decades long war, everything is because of some root causes, right? Now the war is over. 2 years, I think it was over in 2009, and now we are living in 2011. So we have to address the root causes. What do you think? Do you think the Sri Lankan government has done enough to address the root causes, especially when it comes to Tamils in this country, to live peacefully with self-respect?
Well, I think we can certainly do much more. I think if you take the root causes of the political problems and the social and economic problems that arose, they started, I think, very much with the language question. You had this very peculiar situation where Sri Lanka had only one official language, but it educated its children in 2 separate languages, one of which was not an official language. You know, this was anomalous and wrong. And I think we have done several things over the last few years, but it's only this government that has begun to bring them together. In 87, Tamil was made an official language.
But was it implemented?
No, not at all. And in the 90s, the government actually began to try to insist that children become at least bilingual. And I think President Kumaratunga's main contribution, I think, to the country was trying to make sure that Sinhalese children learned Tamil and Tamil children learned Sinhala, and also trying to make sure that English medium was restored, which was actually a way of an amity school concept of allowing children to study together, which had been stopped, legally stopped, which is madness. Now this happened in her period, but of course it was this government and Mr. Gunasekara, to whom all credit, who actually introduced regulations that made it mandatory for public servants to know the other language. But of course we need to be more proactive about encouraging more recruitment of Tamils into the public sector, because that went down disproportionately because of language policies and also because of the LTT not encouraging people to apply.
And the 83 riots as well.
Yeah, and we need to actually try to get more Tamil recruits to the security services, the police and the army in particular. In this respect, a very important initiative of the Secretary of Defence, which was, even while the war was raging, he encouraged the recruitment of Tamil police officers through the Cadet Corps. But unfortunately, I gather the Ministry of Education has put a stop to that. And that type of thing has to be continued further. Other things that I think we really need to move further on are developing teacher training policies much better, allowing private sector involvement, so that in the north and east, which have not enough teachers, but also in areas like the Uva province, North Central province, which have suffered badly from what I call Western province oriented teacher recruitment systems, we have better teachers. So we have to develop human relations in those areas. I think we also need particularly to develop our public servants more. Now, I was delighted, I've just been told today of a really good program done by, I think, the PIM to encourage public servants to become trainers in English. And I was delighted to find that only the public servants in the north and east had applied. I'm afraid that our public servants in the rest of the country have just not bothered. So this shows a commitment, as I told you, the websites of the north and east. So I think the public servants there are much more committed to delivering service. And we have to encourage that culture in all our public servants. So there are positive areas that we can move on, but I think education and training are the keys, together with entrepreneurship development. Don't forget that one of the problems of our educational system was for a long time we allowed people to grow up thinking that the only source of employment was the state. It was destructive, because people have so much energy and capacity that we must allow them the chance to develop their own lives. And therefore you need much more business-friendly policies, you need much more microcredit, you need to encourage the young people of the north and the east as well as elsewhere to take their life into their own hands. Work on things like small and medium business enterprises. We're not doing enough to encourage them at the moment. We have to do much more in those areas.
But before that, I have another important question, Professor. Say, after the war, do you think, how do you look at the attitudes of the singular majority? Have they changed a little bit, so that, you know, have they changed to share some power with the Tamil-speaking community in this country? And how do you look at the attitudes of the Tamil community?
Well,
have they changed?
The Sinhala community, right through, had a very consistent position if you look at all the polls that were conducted. And the reason I say that these are not peculiar is they gave two very clear messages. One is the Sinhala community as a whole wanted the LTT destroyed. But secondly, they wanted more power sharing. All the polls conducted in that period, particularly 2004, 5, 6, 7, because they had, earlier they were in favor of negotiating the LTT, but the Sinhala community learned long before the Ranil Wickremesinghe government that the LTT wasn't interested in negotiation. So they took up the stand, which this government admirably fulfilled, that terrorists, having been given a chance to talk, if they refuse to talk, you can't continue to allow them to exist. But that was accompanied by very clear evidence, all the Marga surveys, all the other surveys, so that the Sinhala people said power sharing is not a problem. So long as the security and the integrity of the country are guarded, and everybody acknowledges that security has to remain with the central government, whether it's military security, whether it's food security, whether it's financial security. But allowing people to exercise power in their own lives, in things like health, education, transport, you have to devolve. And I don't think the Sinhala people have ever disliked that. The way they responded after the war to the needs of the Tamil community were great. I think we are not harnessing that enough. We should be doing much more work with the diaspora to get the Sinhala communities as well as the Tamil communities to work together to sponsor support for entrepreneurship and so on in the North and East. I think that's where we can show the deep commitment of, I think, all the people of this country to the welfare of each other.
With that, Professor, I think we have discussed a lot. I hope that the listeners who have been listening to this program must have got some message from this program. Thank you very much, Professor Rajiva Wijesinha, parliamentarian and advisor to HE on reconciliation, just giving us this time and explaining some important concepts and the ideas to the Sri Lankans, maybe also to the international community. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we thank you once again, and we would like to see you on another day to discuss more on this particular subject.
Thank you and good night.
With that, we conclude the Roundtable Outlook, and we'll be meeting you all next Wednesday again at the same time. Thank you.